Hello everyone, my name is Phil Calvert and a warm welcome to the Financial Advisor Mastermind and Challenge. Throughout this week, advisors, leading experts and consultants to the financial planning profession are sharing amazing insights into just what makes a world-class financial advice business. Today I'm delighted to be speaking with someone who is a specialist in helping people to answer tough questions from clients, colleagues and the media. For over 20 years, he was foreign correspondent for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and today he uses his skills and experience as a much in-demand presentation and communication coach and international speaker. Please welcome one of my favourite Australians, Mr. Michael Dodd. How are you doing, Michael?
Phil Calvert. G'day IFAs, g'day financial planners.
We'll be getting a few good days in there today, which is great. Nice to see you, Michael. Thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate your time. Just tell us a little bit about what you used to do in the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and how that sort of formed what you do today.
I was trained by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation in the art of asking blowtorch on the belly questions. So that's a technical term, but I reckon your IFAs and financial planners are smart enough to work out what that is. The kind of questions that prime ministers get subjected to day after day, and the kind of thing which chief executives get when something goes terribly wrong. And we were drilled in this. And when I was starting in the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, they liked a bit of drama in the radio and television interviews that we had to do. And each day we'd come in and we'd be set a challenge. I know you and your audience like challenges, and we'd have the challenge of interviewing a politician who was actually one of our far more experienced reporters, and we had to put them under pressure.
Right.
And so this was quite a fun experience if you're asking the questions. And so I got to put that in practice in Canberra, in the national capital, and Australian politics is really rough. So the journalists are really rough and the politicians are even rougher. And then when I became a foreign correspondent, I was able to subject people in Europe in particular, and America sometimes, to the kind of tough questioning which had a bit more edge than what they were often used to. And I got more and more into being invited by PR companies to come along as a blowtorch on the belly questioner, to come in and test out their clients. And I learned through that there were certain techniques that they could do, and which I've subsequently helped to develop, where you can give great answers to tough questions, however tough they are. You can get across a positive point, which is the kind of thing we're going to be dealing with in this session, and the kind of thing which IFAs and financial planners and accountants, and I've worked with a lot of accountants in particular, they get them from their clients, they get them from prospects who are considering going with them or possibly with someone else. And so the kind which work for media interviews can, with some adjustments, work really well with clients, with prospects, with colleagues, even with HMRC if you want to try that. So we can explore that and even set a challenge for your people on how they can get better. Because the really good news that I've found from working with a lot of chief executive group audiences is that this kind of thing is a learnable skill. So I can go back into my old mode of being a blowtorch on the belly questioner and subject them to tough questioning. And when they've been trained and they've picked up those learnable skills, they can look far more impressive to their prospects, to their clients, and anyone else who's asking.
I'm guessing in this day and age, transparency is a word that's being used all the time, and organizations, both large and small, have to account for their actions, be it financially, socially, in the local community, how they deal with their staff. So presumably this is an area that's getting really important right now. We'll talk about politicians in a minute, but just within the corporate world.
Absolutely. And interestingly, when I was in discussions with my publishers, Wiley, when we brought out a book, Great Answers to Tough Questions at Work, they were wanting to make sure that I addressed this issue, and also that we promoted the book on that basis. Yeah. And they actually came up with the term, the age of accountability. And there's actually, with the transparency you mentioned, and certainly with social media and the speed of the internet and 24-hour news, people are subjected to more accountability, and they're required by the media and by others to show more transparency, more than they used to back, say, 20 or 30 years ago. And so giving great answers to tough questions, whether it's just a one-to-one conversation with you and a prospect, or whether it's when something has gone wrong within your organization, or when you're commenting as an expert, as accountants and financial planners sometimes get called upon to do so, then you need to be being accountable yourself, and you're often held up. If your company is in the frame, you are actually under more pressure than you would have been, because it's so much easier to look at what you said earlier on social media and hold you to account for that, or look at some recording that someone made on their mobile phone when you gave that speech in the cafeteria and you said X, and now they're saying, well, your actions are now Y. Why aren't you being consistent?
Okay, that's really interesting. So let's just relate this to politicians, because that's the most obvious example that we see. First of all, they're obviously trained in how to answer tough questions, and quite often when I watch journalists, I quite often get the feeling they're not asking tough enough questions. The politician's been trained. They don't answer the question, which I find, presumably the electorate find that increasingly frustrating, and nobody actually benefits from that kind of communication. How do we get past that?
Well, on the questioning side, there's always scope. I do train quite a lot of journalists in the skill of blowtorch on the belly questioning, because it's not as easy as it looks. Some people think it's just a matter of arguing the point, and it isn't. It's a matter, from the questioner's point of view, of making sure everything you say is a question. That keeps you in control as an interviewer, and your audience, if they're ever moderating a panel discussion or something, might do well to remember that. And there's a lot of bad practice out there at the moment, not just on the commercial stations, occasionally even on the, God forbid, the BBC, who are traditionally good at this, but they often lapse. And you've got journalists who are there just arguing, and that doesn't work. On the other side of the fence, the answers, one of the things that I make sure that the people I train do is answer the question, because you and I and everyone else know when someone is obviously ducking a question. You know, we talk about sleazy, slimy politicians. You don't, if you say to a business person, do you want to come across like a sleazy politician? I say, no. And of course they shouldn't. And the politicians, when they're doing it badly, are avoiding the question. They're getting across their point sometimes, but not really answering the question. And as we get into this, what you'll find is, what I advocate is, yes, you do answer the question, or at least you explain why you can't answer the question, but you also get across a message. Usually, though not always, a positive message. I mean, it can be negative, like an accountant could say to a client, if you don't pay your taxes on time, you'll have to pay more. That's a message. It's a negative message, but it's in the interest of the client to know that. So it's important, a person who's answering questions in whatever environment, to make sure they're contributing something valuable and positive, as well as actually dealing with the details of the question.
Yeah, in the media training that I've had when I was working for large insurance companies, we were kind of taught that if a journalist wants to talk to you, they're looking for an angle or a story, but it's actually an opportunity for me to get across the point that I want to make. Is that still the case these days?
Absolutely. You're looking for a win-win, and this applies to conversations with the media or with your prospects, with your clients, is you're giving them something that's useful to them. And you do want to be giving across, normally a positive message that's helpful to them. And if you get it right, you're in the win-win zone. And it may even be what I call the win-win-win zone, where it's you and the person asking the question and the wider audience, whether they're on TV or, in this case, taking part, watching their screen, watching two other people talk. The important thing from the person who's answering the questions is to make sure you're getting across the point that's helpful to you, obviously, but in particular that's helpful to the person asking the question and to that wider audience. And, the wider audience, people who sit at home and watch the news and complain when it comes to Brexit that politicians are not giving the straightest, clearest possible answers sometimes. And we can all learn by watching the media. In fact, when I train people, the dream scenario is to have 2 sessions. One where they're learning the basics, and you typically do a blowtorch on the belly question session with them and see what they're like naturally, often not very good, surprise, surprise. And then you reconstruct them, give them some formulas which help, give them some training exercises. And by the end of the day, they're better than they were at the start, but they're not perfect. But then they go away and watch media and you see them in a whole new light, both from the questioner's point of view. You'll see when the journalists are doing a good job. And I have to say, he's no longer on our screens regularly, but Jeremy Paxman, tough guy. You could almost describe him as an Australian-style blowtorch on the belly.
Yeah.
I mean, he was good, even when he was snarling and snapping. And sometimes he would make statements, but there was always a question behind it. So he's good. And if you watch how people react to him or his kind of interviewing, you can see who's dull and who isn't after you've been trained, because you see it in a whole new light. And those who do well do answer the question and positive message for Jeremy Paxman or whoever it is, and for the wider audience.
That's really interesting. If you look at journalists and the skills they have asking questions, Paxman's a great example. Another one I think who was hugely widely respected was David Frost, who had such a charming demeanour about how he asked questions. Yet he really got to the heart of the matter, didn't he?
He did, and David Frost was not a blowtorcher exactly. That wasn't his style. He was more charming than Jeremy Paxman, has to be said. Yeah. Probably even more charming than Michael Dodd. Can you believe it?
Amazing.
I actually made a reference to one of David Frost's interviews in Great Answers to Tough Questions at Work, because I spoke about those very famous interviews he did with Richard Nixon. And he wasn't asking particularly pointy questions in Australian political terms or Paxman terms, but he was quite persistent in getting to the point. And some of your older viewers of this, Phil, might an answer that Nixon gave to one question. The question wasn't so important, but the answer was, and it hung Nixon effectively. He said, if the president does it, then it's legal.
Right.
And the implications of that are huge. And so you can imagine what would happen if Donald Trump said something like that. There'd be a bit of an uproar. And there was an uproar around this. And that was sort of seen as Nixon's final epitaph in a lot of ways, that he thought what he was doing was legal because he was the president.
Yeah.
And he did what he liked, which explains all the crimes of Watergate and the Watergate cover-up and everything else. And one of the things that's important to people wanting to get better at answering questions is don't just sit there the night before and plan for the really tough ones. Remember, you need to have this reservoir of positive messages that you want to get across. And the soft questions are often the best time to get those across, right. The easiest way to get them across. And sometimes people can get stumped completely by the soft question.
That's
and
interesting.
The Nixon Frost one is exactly right. I mean, Nixon wasn't stumped in the sense he had nothing to say, but what he said was devastating to himself and made him, gave him sort of etched in stone some of the dubious ethics that underpinned his thinking.
That's interesting. So you're saying, yes, prepare for the tough questions, but be ready for the easy questions as well, because that could be a good moment to make something really positive.
Yes, and the fundamental learning point that it's really helpful for IFAs and financial planners to know is that if you're going into a conversation with a prospect, and maybe it's the prospect who's got some financial knowledge, you've probably got a mix of clients, some who've got virtually none, and some who have lots. And let's suppose it's someone who's perhaps been in business for a long time, they've had accountants, and perhaps they're not happy with their accountant. And so you're thinking, well, this person is probably going to ask me some tough questions because he knows about things. He's not satisfied with the kind of advice he's been getting. So I could be subjected to some quite tough questions here. And, if he asks about particular laws or the way, Her Majesty's Customs and Revenue interpret this particular point now, and, if you can't answer that, that's a problem to that person asking the question. So you want to be ready for the tough one. But also, if you've got those messages right, the kind of things you want to get across, then you can utilize those in answer to the tough questions and the softer questions as well. And then you've got that feeling going into the discussion, you're ready for anything, which is what you want to be. That's
really interesting. So when financial advisors do the sort of getting to know their client bit, is it useful to know a client's questioning style as well? Can you see, there'll be some clients who want detail, minute, that kind of detail, and there'll be other clients who are really quite relaxed and they're looking for a much more trustworthy relationship where they can ask the loosest of questions. Am I going to be okay in the future? That sort of thing. Would that be a useful skill for advisors to learn about different questioning styles?
Yes, you don't have to know a lot of detail about what you're going for, but supposing you've been dealing with some people at a medium range level in a company, and they say the boss, wants to sort out his own financial plan, or he wants you to look at this particular project. It's really important. It would be a good one for you to win. He's really tough or something. Then it's a good idea before any discussion to get an idea of the person or people that you're dealing with. One of the things that I say is, start with the audience. What does that particular audience, whether it's one person or a board or a whole audience at a conference, what do they need from me? And if you can picture this, sometimes do a PowerPoint slide on this, but you don't need it. If you have one circle, which is the audience agenda, what that particular audience needs to know. And then you've got another circle, which is hopefully an overlapping circle, right? And that's your agenda, what you can usefully say to this audience. And you want to be thinking in advance about the overlap point. That's where the win-win is between you and the audience. And that is, what do they know that I can provide? Because there might be some things that you can't provide because it's not your specialty area, but there's other things that might be your specialty area, which are not of interest or of use to them. But if you think about it in advance and you want to, before the big questioning thing, always find out, not just about the style, but about the substance that is required, then you can work out the right messages for them, which you can feed into tough questions, soft questions, and intermediate questions as well, and make sure that at the end of your hour or 2 hours of discussions, that you've got those messages across. And therefore, there's a win-win there for you and them, and perhaps anyone else who reads the transcript or looks at the video of it afterwards.
Yeah, I see. So just thinking about our financial advisors now, when it comes to working with the media, there's a relatively small number who are very experienced at this. And they go out of their way to have interviews and be interviewed by industry press and industry media. And they do that largely because it raises their profile, but anything that goes into one of the industry's papers, magazines, New Model Advisor, Money Marketing, Financial Advisor, all those sort of magazines, invariably will go online as well. Which is good for SEO and then get picked up by Google. So they spend time talking to industry journalists because it positions them well and it gets picked up by Google. But what we're now starting to see is a few more financial advisors doing things like local radio interviews, a personal finance hour on TV. Some of them are being podcast interviewees, this kind of thing. Are there any tips for the newbie, basically, as they get started in their raising their profile by talking to the media?
Yeah, well, let's take the tough end of the market first, because I train people for this specifically, is phone-ins. And that's the really tough end of the market. It's one thing to be up against an interviewer who might ask you some tough questions, but when we've got people people from around the country, if it's a national program, or possibly even around the world on a BBC World Service phone in, asking questions. Anything can happen. And so we really want to go into that having thought about it. You know, there is a saying that I picked up from a number of people, which is not good, which is, I hope they ask me the right question.
Yeah.
And the journalists generally think it's their job to ask the wrong questions, the ones that are going to cause some discomfort, whether it's to an expert or a politician. And the public are often even tougher, because, you know,
Yes.
they can ring up and explain their situation, and it involved the death of their mother or something. And there's all sorts of emotional stuff, and it's raw and real.
Yeah.
And you're there as the expert, having to say something useful about the situation.
Well, can I give you an example? Can I give you an example
please.
of that? I heard a financial advisor on an afternoon radio show. They seemingly were getting on well, and then somebody phoned up from wherever they were in the country, and they said, just in such a straightforward way to the financial advisor, said, you know, since the financial crash, the markets, we can't trust bankers, we can't trust financial advisors. How can we trust anyone in financial services? And that was his question.
Yeah, that's a nice one. And that's the kind of thing you want to be ready for. And so you're thinking, if you've got a positive message or a series of positive messages, you want to be dipping into it. And you don't always have to be ready for every possible question. And you certainly can't predict every possible question. But you probably should have been ready for that one, just in general terms, because there is a lot of distrust about professions, and the fact that people can talk to each other on social media and things happen as Twitter storms break out on something that some expert said. You need to be more ready for that than ever before. So you do want to do some thought. Don't just think, I hope it'll be all right on the night. You want to be thinking about it. But if you're doing radio, I mean, there is an advantage that you've got as opposed to television, and that is, you can take some notes, and you want to do that so that you can have your messages and key points written down, and you can refer to those on radio. Be aware that some of the radio stations have a camera in them, and a few people out there watch on the internet, but that's pretty rare. So most audience can't see the notes. But you can use them. And if you're covering an area, and this is one for financial planners and IFAs, you know, a lot of detail, if you can spread your notes out, on the desk in front of the questioner in the studio or at home if you're doing it on the phone, and you want to have it and have key things marked so that you can refer to a particular act or a particular judgment or something and say something useful and be that encyclopedia. So you can be ready for that, which is good. But fundamentally, you want to make sure you've got this bucket full of messages, and someone's asking a question about trust, and you would, as an IFA or a financial planner who's well prepared for a situation like a phone-in, you want to be ready for that kind of thing. And you want to be thinking, there's a couple of things to get yourself in the right mindset beforehand. You want to be thinking, what is the most useful, the best thing that I can say on this topic of trust? And there's also a technique which you may find useful in that kind of situation, which is called the general to the specific. Now, they're asking a general question about trust in professional people, and you can then deal with the issue, because I'm trying to get you to face up to the issues, but you can be then specific about how you or how your colleagues deal with that.
I see.
And so there might be good reasons. You could maybe, I'm not a financial expert, but the financial experts are listening. You probably get your own investments on behalf of clients audited by someone. And so you could be saying, well, we get this particular auditor, who is particularly tough, and he writes a report, every year, or he looks at things. There might be some monitoring system, and you can move from the general situation about trust in everybody, and you're there. You can say, well, I've got trust in quite a number of my colleagues, but you probably can't give a blank check and say you can guarantee they're all perfect. But you can narrow it down to what you do and give an example, and examples are really important, of the kind of thing that you do,
I see.
which shows your clients why they can trust you and why they can have more confidence in their investments that you've organized for them than perhaps with some competitors.
I see. And are there different techniques depending on the situation as well? So, for example, we touched on it a little bit earlier. Maybe you're on a panel at a conference. Do you answer the question to the questioner, or do you answer to the audience? What's the best way to do it to make the most of the opportunity?
In that case, if you've got a member of the audience or the moderator asking a question, but hopefully the question is applicable to everyone.
Yeah.
And if it isn't, it's kind of your job to make it as applicable to as many people as possible. So as far as eye contact is concerned, typically you probably start off looking at the questioner, but if you've got a real live audience there, roam your eyes around like you should do if you're giving a presentation, so that everybody feels included. So it's the physicality of it is to include everybody. And in terms of the content of the answer, make sure the content of the answer, particularly if someone's asking on a very specific point, which might be important to them, it's kind of your job as the answerer to actually do the opposite of what I said. I spoke about the rule from the general to the specific. There's another rule, you'll never guess what this one's called, the specific to the general, where you're giving a bit of specific information to that person who's hung up on that issue, but you are taking the initiative yourself because you're trying to be helpful to the whole audience to address the general situation.
Yeah.
And if you do that, and obviously keep eye contact with everyone at the same time, you may be invited back to go on the next panel as well.
Yeah, yeah. So you're saying, first of all, never go into these situations, whether it's a radio show, whether it's a journalist interview, TV, podcast, or a panel at a conference, never go in unprepared and ready with having thought through what questions you think you're going to get asked. That's the first point.
Absolutely. But don't rely on the fact that your predictions will be right. If you've got those messages right, they will also be applicable to other questions which you hadn't even thought of.
Okay.
But you do want to ask, when you're preparing, you're thinking, what are the logical things they're likely to ask? Also, particularly if it's media, there's a question to ask yourself beforehand, but it can also apply to a conference. It's what else is on the radar?
Okay.
What else is out there? So if you're a government minister, and I imagine we haven't got too many government ministers who are also financial planners, but if you're a government minister and you're on the Today program on Radio 4, which all the shakers and movers and lots of other people listen to, you may be the Minister for Education, but if something really big happens to do with Brexit or to do with an international crisis, if you're the government minister there, the program will expect to at least ask you about this broader problem that the government needs to deal with. And if you don't know about it at all, you can look like an idiot. What else is on the radar? What new things have happened in the financial world that people could be asking me about? What's happened in the news at least, a couple of hours before? Ideally, if you're really doing a cutting edge topic, you want to be listening to the news right up to the minute. So that you're aware of the latest twist and turn in Brexit or whatever it is, so that you can avoid being caught out, and you can be getting across your positive messages, but also adapting them to whatever the latest is, because journalists always want to know what the latest is, and people at a conference, on a particular topic will also want to know what the latest is.
Okay, that's really interesting. So let's just use that as an example. And I've asked a few financial advisors what typical tough questions are that they have had in the past and are getting now. So would it be okay if we just go through two or three of them just to see how they might approach?
Now, I won't give the answers because I'm not an expert.
No, fair enough.
But what we can do is, between us, work out what might be the right positive message to get across.
Okay.
And we could possibly suggest what might be a good example to use to illustrate it.
Okay.
Now, I won't have the actual example, but I can point you or anyone else in the right direction.
Yeah.
And one of the things is, in this preparation, is you're thinking, what are the messages I need to get across to this particular audience? And what examples can I use to illustrate them, to paint a picture in the mind? Now, in finance world, it could be, an example that involves numbers. I had a client with your problem the other day, and he had an income of X, and we had this investment, and we're expecting in 20 years' time he will be in this situation. So you've got an example that involves numbers, and obviously that's going to be typical for your people. So when I say example, I mean a situation that you can talk about and possibly give some ballpark figures for, to paint a picture in the mind of the audience so that they will get it.
Okay, that's a really interesting one.
Remember it.
One that's just sprung to mind is, a typical question that a client might ask. Maybe they're nearing retirement or something like that. Could be something along the lines of, will I have enough money to see me through my retirement and into the next 20, 30 years or so? Now, a number of financial advisors don't know the answer to that, although they do have software. They use tools like cash flow modeling software, and they can plug a lot of data in now, and it projects into the future. So a question like, will I have enough money? To some extent, you can support your answer with your software, but what's a good way to answer a question like that? You could just be honest and say, no, you won't have enough money.
Well, number one is there is a formula. I will give it to you and to our viewers. Yeah. The formula is as simple as A, B, C, D, E. Right. So it's easy to remember. And let me just very quickly talk you through it. And then with the other questions that you've got in your mind, we can apply the formula to it. Now, this is the formula, I have to say, for most questions, but not all. It's for most questions that are involving factual matters. There's a different formula for dealing with highly emotionally charged situations where the questioner thinks you've done something wrong or that it's your fault, like the investments didn't work out and their cozy retirement has collapsed. If they're asking questions about that, leave this formula aside. But this is for most of the questions, A, B, C, D, E. So A is, amazingly enough, answer the question. Yeah, give the initial details to answer the question. Now, if you can't answer the question, and this is what the politicians fall down on a lot, is tell us why you can't answer the question.
Okay.
Now, there could be lots of good reasons for a financial planner or a government minister talking about Brexit as to why they don't know exactly what the situation will be for the car industry in 2027. Yeah, all sorts of reasons. So if you don't know the answer, just very briefly explain why. That takes the pressure off. And also what you're going to do about it to get the answer. So it might be, I can't answer that myself in this meeting, but I can feed in all the numbers that you give me, and in a week's time I can give you the answer.
Okay.
Or I consult a colleague of mine who's a specialist in that area, and I can provide an answer from him for you. So that's all part of the A. So answer it or explain briefly why you can't and what you're going to do about it.
Okay.
B is then, it's called a bridge. It's just a few words that, because you've dealt with the question, you've given the answer, or you've said why you can't and what you're doing about it, you can then, you've got a license under the normal rules of communication to move things on a little bit.
Yeah.
And bridge will do that. A bridge is a simple formula of words, such as what you really need to know in a situation is this. Or really important when you're making a decision about your financial future is this, right? So it's just a few words to move things on. And then you go to C, which is the content. It's the content of your message on this topic. So that's the thing that you probably have got prepared. You should have prepared. It's the right message for this particular situation. So you get across the content of the message. And then D and E, they go together. It's dangle and example. Now, dangle is like another bridge. It's another way of just moving it on. And I say dangle because the example is usually enticing. You know, a really good example of someone in your situation who I was dealing with last week was client X. You probably wouldn't name them, but an 83-year-old who had this situation, or a 22-year-old who had this situation, So you just say, a really good example is And then E is give the example. And you want to typically have those examples thought out beforehand.
Okay, so that sounds a really interesting formula. So could a financial advisor, just by way of example, who's perhaps going for an interview to work at another financial advice firm, could they use that formula in answering interview questions?
Absolutely. And so one of the things, if you're going for a job interview, is you want to be able to demonstrate. It's all very well to say, I'm a brilliant financial planner, I'm just what you need, which may be, hopefully in more modest terms, the message you're trying to get across, but you don't want to say it like that.
Yeah.
But the way to really be convincing to the interview panel is to give examples of things that you have done that show that you are really good at this situation and that situation. So the examples are really important, which is why you want to have them thought out in advance. And you're dipping into your examples, and you want to always be building those up. So you're thinking, yes, I had this situation, and a good one I can give to this particular client for this job interview or whatever it is.
Okay.
So you dangle the example, and you want to have that example thought out in advance, typically, because often if you just dive into it on the spur of the moment, there could be a downside to the example, which shows that it wasn't the best example to choose. Yeah. Maybe the client left you, even though you've given them this brilliant idea because something else went wrong. But you need to be able to answer questions about that. So that may not be the best example to choose.
I see.
You want to be making sure you're picking the right example. Now, you can still have downsides within the example, and that's good if you do that. You know, it wasn't easy solving this problem, but what we did was we worked out this. So you're kind of showing the struggle, but you're giving the example. So the idea is in the job interview or with the clients, with the prospects, you end your great answer with the example. You've painted the picture in their minds and you shut up. And what they're likely to do next is then ask another question relating to your example. Could you do that for me? Could you do that for our company? Yeah, and that's an easy question.
I see. That's a really interesting formula. And I'm mentioning with financial advisors, some questions are going to be factual stuff. Some questions are going to be about things that have already happened or not happened, and some questions are going to be about what do you think is going to happen. So that formula would help you with that latter category. Yeah,
but let's have a look at what's actually happened. A simple factual thing.
Okay.
How does Her Majesty's Customs and Revenue deal with situation X, right? And you know the answer. So you give the answer, but you still need to go beyond. And one of the fundamental messages that I've got for your audience is when you're answering a seemingly factual question, could be a David Frost-like soft question, as discussed earlier, make sure you also get across a message. Because it's not just about the fact got the answer. In fact, because you know that kind of thing, you can apply that kind of answer to all manner of situations. And it could be a message, that you're an absolute expert on the finer points of this aspect of taxation law, and you can therefore equip your clients to deal with this situation. So traps that what I call task-orientated introverts, and they're typically accountants' personality, which is very good at analyzing, know lots about detail, but are not always particularly comfortable at conversations, professional and otherwise. So what you need to do those soft questions is make sure, and you've got to force yourself to do this sometimes, if you are a task-orientated introvert, is force yourself to be a little introverted by volunteering a little bit more. Which may not be your natural inclination. Your natural inclination might be, that's the answer, full stop, end of. But you're often not getting across, you're not kind of winning in that way. You're just getting across the message, you're just getting across the answer, and that's it. So the bridging, the content message, followed by the example, helps you to demonstrate your authority, as well as give the person confidence that you know more than just the answer to that question.
So you're kind of adding a layer of value on top of the answer.
Absolutely. So the fundamental thing when you're going into these interviews is you're planning to win. You want to win-win for them and for you. But for you to win, you want to be making sure, if I use a sporting analogy here, take football, every time the ball comes to you, you kick a goal.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's pretty much what you want. If you're dealing with a prospect or a job interview panel, you want to be doing that. Whatever the question is, whether it's how did you start in this business, a sort of a soft general thing, or what would you do if this situation happened and you had given the client the wrong information, what would you do then? Or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, a tougher question. Whatever it is, you want to be kicking a goal every time the ball comes to you. So beware the soft question or the easy question. And if you just give the simple, straightforward answer, it's section X of the tax law, section V111, full stop. You may be answering their question, but you're probably not getting across a message, and you're probably not adding value or demonstrating how useful you can be to them.
I see. So, I would imagine also most financial advisors have got a pretty good idea of the typical questions that most clients are going to ask. And much the same question gets asked in a different context. So, for example, from time to time, we see the stock market going up and down, and advisors just know that a number of clients are going to get in touch and say, what do we do about this? And, there's a very topical one right now with Brexit. One financial advisor told me that they're getting the question, what is going to happen with Brexit? So the client is clearly referring to their money. What's going to happen? Is it going to go up? Are we going to lose it all? And they're kind of asking for the advisor's opinion. Is there a right or a wrong way to deal with that sort of situation?
There's lots of wrong ways. Let's focus on the right way. So if we go back to the ABCD formula, we can probably together work out the kind of thing they need to say. Now, I imagine with what's going to happen with Brexit? I mean, even the Prime Minister doesn't know what's going to happen in Brexit because, in the period leading up to our conversation here today, she's had, and it may still be a she in a few weeks' time, maybe it won't be, but at the time we're talking, it's a female Prime Minister, and she's had a couple of defeats in a row in Parliament. So she hasn't got control of the House of Commons, which, if you're a Prime Minister, is a bit of a problem. So, she doesn't know the exact answer. So if you're a financial planner, you don't know exactly how, at this particular moment that we're talking, how Brexit is going to pan out. Part of your answer there might be very briefly, well, of course, we don't know exactly because, of whatever reason. And it's pretty easy to explain why, with the politics being so fluid, you can't give a specific example as to what's going to happen to the value of the pound in November or in December next year. Yeah. So briefly, show the limits to what can be known as part of your answer, but you might be able to give something that's useful. It might be you might refer to a prediction that was made by someone who's been right before in predicting things in difficult situations. About what the currency is going to do, for example, or what the stock market's going to do in relation to this. Yeah. So that's part of your A, right? Now the bridge, which is, we can have a standard one here. What's important for someone in your position to know, right? So you're now moving on to your message. Yeah. Now you can help me, Phil, about the kind of message. I imagine the word reassurance or something will come
they'll want to reassure them.
Might need to be qualified.
Yeah, they'll want to reassure them that over the long term, period, yes, the stock market can go up and down on a daily basis, but over the long term, they'd want to reassure them that the market has consistently gone up. I would imagine that's got to be in there somewhere. Yeah.
I mean, you might even have a graph to show people of what's happened to the stock market between the 1960s and now, so they can see the long-term trends and what's happened when there's been a bit of a financial crisis and how it's been sorted out typically, relatively quickly if you take the long-term view. Yeah. So you want that part of your message may be, well, if you take the long-term approach, then you can expect on the basis of performance this. Yeah. And now I'm not going to venture and say what it is, but you need to get across that message, and you might be the assurance, something that we touched on earlier, about what systems your company has in place to monitor and possibly to change the balance between the really safe ones and the more unsafe but higher yielding ones.
I see.
Whatever.
So,
You might have a message around that. And
I
then
see.
you need to move on. And then you need to move on and give an example. So
Right.
you might, and that's where, if you've been in the game a long time, you can probably, let's go back to the financial crisis in the early 2000s. You might be able to talk about a particular client then who was asking the same question.
I see.
And explain what they do and what the investments did in the longer term, so that you're painting that picture. And I'm assuming that there's a outcome and you're finishing on that positive outcome. It's not an absolute guarantee for this person, but you're saying I think it's more valuable. What will happen in a similar time of uncertainty? And that's the bones of a good answer.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. I can see how that formula really works. Let's just look at one more. We're in a world now where financial advisors charge fees. They don't take commission anymore, and that, of course, was a regular question in the past. How can we be sure that you're recommending the right solution to us if you're being paid commission? So that's all been put to bed pretty well now. But we're living in the world of the internet, where consumers have greater access to information about personal finances, investments, retirement planning than ever before. So a question might be, well, I can get all the help I need online or from my mate in the pub. That's the worst one. How can you justify the fees that you're charging me? That could be a typical question.
Yeah, so you'd be thinking of your experience. And often the example is the first thing that you should be thinking for. Have you got an example of someone who was saying this before 10 years ago? And maybe it could be a good example or a worrying example. Be slack position, and they decided not to have a financial advisor, to rely on their mate in the pub and rely on the internet, and now they're homeless wandering the streets.
Yeah.
Because it all went wrong. Yeah, you might have an example like that, or conversely, you might have an example of exactly the opposite. One of your clients who stuck with you even though they were something of an expert themselves, and they had a friend in the pub who gave them some advice, which was sometimes helpful. And he was able to perhaps, check out what you were doing from a higher level of understanding than most clients. And he's in this situation. So often the thing about ABCDE is, if you think of the example, you can end on the example, the direction that you need to go to get to that example.
I see.
That's often the way to make sure, despite interruptions that can happen and other questions along the way, that you are giving over the course of the conversation. Each time you are getting to the point, you're kicking that goal, giving them example, giving them the picture in their mind, so that they can fully understand what you're getting and buy into your message so much more easily.
I see. That's really interesting. Thank you so much for that, Michael. This is really, really great stuff. And I just happen to have a copy of your book here. Great answers to tough questions. Presumably that's on Amazon, and they can get it.
It is on Amazon. It's sold on the publisher's website. Well, but Amazon is the place to go. There's an audio version on Audible.
What was it?
So if you want it read to you in a soothing, pleasant Australian voice of authenticity, then you can go on Audible and get it there.
Fantastic. And, I'm imagining that formula, the ABCD formula we've been talking about here, that's all in there along with quite a lot more. It's a really substantial book, so looks superb.
And it has the other formula I mentioned for when something goes wrong. There's a crisis formula for when someone's really emotionally upset, which is a bit different from ABCD, because ABCD can seem a bit callous sometimes if you apply that ruthlessly to when someone's just or worried about losing all their money, or they had a friend who lost all their money, and you have to touch emotions. So there's a formula in the book there for that situation. And a tribute to the publishers Wiley on this, they divided it into two halves, a game in two halves, as the sporting cliche goes. First half is the theory. So that's giving you the formulas and the things you need to think about in your preparation. And the second half is execution, practice. So it was their idea, and I thought it was a really good one, to divide the second half into all different kinds of situations. So you've got the one about job interview, You've got the one from prospects. You've got questions from clients, questions from the boss, questions from the media. So the second half is execution. So often when I'm working with people one-to-one or in groups, if they read the book along the way, then they come back and we have a session at a higher level so that we are adapting the theory and everything that's in the second half of the book to their situation, to put them in a situation where they're a lot more confident.
So just turning this around the other way, financial advisors, as I said, increasingly doing podcasts where they have guests, but fundamentally they ask clients questions. And presumably the better the answer, the better information they have to help that client. I mean, is there a right way to ask a great question?
One of the things when I'm training journalists, and this applies to questions and all things, is take yourself out of it. And a lot of bad questions on the media and elsewhere are basically the questioner, who's supposed to be the questioner, putting their opinion and then saying maybe at the end, what do you think about that?
Okay.
And one of the tricks that I learned when I was through this process at the US Broadcasting Corporation was you want to have as the questioner, whether you're questioning your client or whoever you're asking questions of, it's good for you to have some views and thoughts, but it's the interview process there is all about them and giving them their chance to shine and giving you, as the financial planner, the IFA, the information you need to help them best. You don't want to be putting your thumb in the scales of the questions.
Okay.
So one way to do that, if you've got an opinion, is to put in a question and have the question, the opinion included in the question, but make sure it's very clear to someone that they've then got open book to say what they think. Now, let's suppose you're dealing with a client who perhaps isn't as well prepared for the future as they should be at their age. Yeah? So you could say something like, let's pretend you're the client, I'm the IFA, I'm the financial planner, and say, is it fair to say that you don't feel as well prepared as you should be for someone who is 57?
Yeah.
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 So you may have a person, your brain is probably saying this person's unprepared. But you don't want to say that, and you don't want to be judgmental because that can affect the answer. But you can incorporate your prejudice, your thought, your opinion in the question, but absolutely bend over backwards to make sure that it is a question. Because the whole thing around about the conversation to be about your view, because you're trying to extract information from them.
Yeah.
And if you're trying to help them with their financial future, you need a certain amount of real information in order to come up with a proposition. So just make sure everything is a question when you're in that phase of the conversation.
I see. Michael, we're pretty well up for time. This has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for helping us out today. One of the things that we're doing as part of these interviews is asking our interviewees if they could set a challenge for the financial advisors who are watching this. It could be a simple challenge, it could be a long challenge, it could be a complicated challenge. Given what we've been talking about today, what would be your challenge for our advisor viewers?
Well, as a reformed, recovering blowtorch on the belly questioner, my challenge would be ask yourself, perhaps for the next 3 days, what is the toughest question I need to be ready for? Yeah. Now, it may be one that's already been asked, or it may be one that you think could be asked. So you've mentioned Brexit a few times, Phil. I mean, there's probably the Brexit question, it could be something about, if this happens in Brexit, what does that mean for my investments on June the 1st?
Yeah.
Or something. It could be quite specific. Yeah. All right. So write yourself down that question and make sure, taking the advice I've just given you, make sure it is a question. Yeah. And then you can be thinking about the ABCD formula, but just think of the C bit. The C bit is the content of the message you want to get across, okay? Right. So you can work out the whole ABCDE if you want to, but my challenge is come up with the right message that you need to get across when that question is asked. Yeah. So if we take an example, we're talking about times of uncertainty with Brexit. The answer is possibly on that one something about reassurance. So you're thinking to yourself, what is the most reassuring one sentence, positive but accurate message that I should be getting across in response to that question, so that I can kick a goal when I'm asked it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you like, and I'll put my email address up at the end, if anyone watching wants to have a go at this, you can send me a very brief email. Don't give me lots of material because I haven't got time to look at all the detail, but just send me a little bit of background about yourself and the situation, but only a little bit, and give me that question in the form of the question, your blowtorch on the belly question, and your message that you would want to get across. So I don't need the whole answer, just the positive message. So if you email me those, I'll give you a response to give you an indication as to whether you're heading in the right direction or perhaps there's something else you need to consider by way of a message for that situation.
Michael, that's very generous of you. Thank you very much indeed. So if people want to get in touch with you, maybe to hire you as well, where can they find you? How can they get in touch with you?
Well, there is the Michael Dodd Communications website. So that's a good place to go. My web designer's put a services page, which he's really pleased about, and I'm really pleased about too, which does show the different things like the master classes or the conference speeches or the one-to-one training or training for teams. So it's quite easy to, if you go to the services page, to click on the right one for you. And I'm very open, as you've suggested, having a discussion on the phone, much the same way as IFAs and financial planners question their potential clients to see if you're the right fit. If you want to give me a call, if you're interested in a particular service, we can work out on the phone whether we are the right fit for you. And that's always a joy.
Fantastic. Thank you. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, your book, Great Answers to Tough Questions, is available in all the usual places. Michael, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Thank you to all our viewers as well. Hope you found it valuable and enjoyable. My name is Phil Calvert. Thanks again to Michael Dodd, and we'll see you on the next video. Thanks a lot.